The moment my father said I was no longer his son, I thought my life was over. I never imagined that same night the most powerful man in America would say 3 words that changed everything. I choose you. Ethan Parker stood beneath the crystal chandelier of the Parker family mansion, surrounded by people who had spent years pretending to care about him. The room was filled with expensive suits, quiet conversations, and the kind of smiles that disappeared the moment Ethan looked away. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of the Parker legacy, a night where his family would announce their future plans. Instead, Ethan became the announcement everyone wanted to forget. His father, Richard Parker, stood at the center of the room with a calm expression that hurt more than anger ever could. "You have embarrassed this family for the last time," Richard said. "You were given every opportunity, and you wasted all of them." Ethan looked around the room, hoping someone would speak up. His older brother looked away. His relatives stayed silent. Not one person moved. For years, Ethan had tried to prove himself. He had worked late nights, solved problems nobody noticed, and quietly supported the family business behind the scenes. But his father only saw him as the son who did not fit the image of perfection he wanted. "From this moment forward, you are no longer part of the Parker family," Richard announced. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. Not because he lost the mansion, not because he lost the money, but because he finally understood that he had been trying to earn love from people who had already decided not to give it. Ethan walked outside into the cold evening air with only a small suitcase in his hand. Rain fell across the driveway as the doors behind him closed. For the first time in his life, there was no family waiting inside. There was no place to return to. Yet somewhere beneath the sadness, a strange feeling appeared. Freedom. Ethan walked through the city streets, unsure where he would sleep or what tomorrow would bring. He had no idea that someone had been watching the entire scene from across the street. Inside a black luxury sedan, Alexander Whitmore stared at the mansion with a thoughtful expression. The world knew Alexander as the richest man in the country, the businessman people called the emperor of industry. He controlled companies, investments, and an empire worth billions of dollars. But despite having everything, Alexander had never met anyone who looked completely defeated and still chose to walk away with dignity. Until Ethan. When Ethan reached the sidewalk, Alexander stepped out of the car. "Ethan Parker," he said. Ethan stopped and looked back, confused. "Do I know you?" Alexander approached slowly, his voice calm. "No, but I know you." Ethan frowned. "That sounds impossible." Alexander looked toward the mansion behind them, then back at him. "Your family made a mistake tonight." Ethan gave a small, tired laugh. "You barely know me." "Maybe," Alexander replied. "But I know the difference between someone who failed and someone who was never given a chance." For the first time that night, Ethan felt like someone actually saw him. He did not know who Alexander Whitmore truly was. He did not know that this meeting would change his entire future. He only knew one thing. The man standing in front of him was the first person who looked at him like he mattered. The first thing Ethan Parker learned after leaving his family home was that the world did not stop just because his heart was broken. The city kept moving. Cars passed through the streets. People rushed into coffee shops with warm drinks in their hands. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, while Ethan stood there with a small suitcase and no idea where he belonged. For years, he had lived inside a beautiful mansion, surrounded by luxury, yet he had never felt more alone. Now he had nothing except the clothes he wore and the memory of a door closing behind him. "You look like someone who needs a place to breathe," Alexander Whitmore said. Ethan looked at the man standing beside him and still could not understand why a stranger would care. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan asked. Alexander remained quiet for a moment. It was unusual. Most people wanted something from him. They wanted business deals, connections, or approval. But Ethan was different. Even after losing everything, he had not asked for money. He had not begged. He had simply accepted the pain and walked away. "Because I saw what happened," Alexander finally answered. "And because I believe your family was wrong about you." Those words stayed in Ethan's mind. Nobody had said that to him before. Not his father. Not his relatives. Not even the people who claimed to know him. Alexander offered to drive Ethan to a private guest residence owned by Whitmore Enterprises. Ethan hesitated. Accepting help from the richest man in the country felt impossible. "I cannot pay you back," Ethan admitted. Alexander looked at him through the rearview mirror. "I did not ask you to." The ride through downtown was quiet, but it was not uncomfortable. For the first time in hours, Ethan did not feel like he had to defend himself. When they arrived at the elegant apartment overlooking the city, Ethan stopped at the entrance. Everything felt too perfect. The polished floors, the large windows, the view of thousands of lights below. It was the kind of place someone like him was never supposed to enter. "You can stay here until you decide your next step," Alexander said. Ethan turned around. "You barely know me." Alexander gave a small smile. "That is exactly why I can see you clearly." Later that night, Ethan sat by the window, watching the city below. He thought about his father's words. He thought about all the years he spent trying to become someone worthy of love. Then he looked around the quiet apartment and realized something important. Maybe being rejected was not the end of his story. Maybe it was the beginning. The next morning, Ethan received a message from an unknown number. It was from Alexander. The message was simple. "Meet me at Whitmore Tower at 10. Ethan arrived at the tallest building in the city and stepped into a world he had only seen in magazines. Employees greeted Alexander with respect as he walked through the lobby. That was when Ethan finally understood who had helped him the night before. The man who offered him kindness was not just wealthy. He was the man everyone called the Emperor of Industry. Alexander led Ethan into his private office, where a surprising conversation was waiting. "I have a proposal for you," Alexander said. Ethan looked confused. "What kind of proposal?" Alexander placed a folder on the desk. A chance to start over. Ethan opened the folder slowly. Inside was an offer that would change both of their lives forever. And for the first time since his family abandoned him, Ethan felt like his future was not something he had lost. It was something waiting to be written. The folder on Alexander Whitmore's desk contained a future Ethan Parker never expected to see. For a moment, Ethan simply stared at the papers in front of him, trying to understand what he was reading. It was not a job offer. It was not a charity agreement. It was something far more unexpected. "You want me to marry you?" Ethan asked quietly. Alexander did not look away. "For 1 year." The words filled the quiet office. Ethan closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, certain he had misunderstood. That is not exactly the kind of proposal people usually receive from a stranger. Alexander remained calm, but there was something different in his expression. Something Ethan could not explain. "I know how it sounds," Alexander said. "But this is not about money. It is about two people who need something the other can provide." Ethan looked toward the enormous windows behind Alexander's desk. From that height, the entire city looked small. He wondered how someone who owned so much could still seem so alone. "Why me?" Ethan asked. Alexander was silent for a few seconds before answering. "Because you are the only person I have met who looked at me without wanting something." Ethan remembered the night before. He remembered Alexander standing beside him when everyone else had turned away. The richest man in the country had treated him like a person, not a problem to solve. Still, the idea felt impossible. "My family just rejected me. I am not exactly someone people would choose right now." Alexander's expression softened slightly. "Your family failed to recognize your value. That does not mean you have no value." Those words reached deeper than Ethan expected. He had spent years hearing what he lacked. He was not ambitious enough. He was not impressive enough. He was not the son his father wanted. But Alexander was the first person who spoke as if Ethan had been overlooked, not defeated. "What happens after 1 year?" Ethan asked. "You walk away," Alexander replied. "With security, independence, and the chance to build your own life." Ethan studied him carefully. There was no pressure in Alexander's voice. No demand. Just an offer. A strange opportunity from a man who seemed impossible to understand. Before Ethan could answer, Alexander added one more thing. "There is another reason." Ethan looked up. "What reason?" Alexander placed another document on the desk. "Your family is preparing to make a move against you." Ethan's heart sank. "What?" Alexander explained that Richard Parker had already started telling people Ethan had abandoned the family by choice. He was trying to control the story before Ethan could tell the truth. Ethan felt a familiar disappointment. Even after everything, his father was still thinking about reputation instead of his son. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked. Alexander looked directly at him. "Because I do not want you to face this alone." The room became quiet. For years, Ethan had wanted someone to stand beside him. Not because he was useful, not because of his family name, simply because he mattered. Slowly, Ethan opened the folder again. The decision was terrifying. It could change everything. But as he looked at the man in front of him, he realized something. Maybe this was not about escaping the life he lost. Maybe this was about finally finding the life he was meant to have. I will agree, Ethan said. Alexander gave a small nod. Then from this moment forward, we moved together. Ethan did not know what the world would say. He did not know how his family would react. But he knew one thing. The person who had been abandoned the night before had just been given a reason to believe in tomorrow. The morning after Ethan Parker accepted Alexander Whitmore's proposal, the world around him changed faster than he could understand. One day, he was the forgotten son of the Parker family. The next day, he was preparing to become the husband of the most powerful businessman in the country. It felt like he had stepped into someone else's life. When Ethan arrived at Whitmore Tower, he expected cold meetings, complicated paperwork, and people who would remind him that he did not belong. Instead, he found something unexpected. Respect. Employees greeted him politely. Assistants treated him with patience. Nobody looked at him like he was a mistake. But Ethan noticed something else. They were watching him. Not with cruelty, but with curiosity. Everyone wanted to know who the person beside Alexander Whitmore really was. "You are nervous," Alexander said as they walked through the private hallway. Ethan glanced at him. "Is it that obvious?" "Yes." Ethan gave a small smile. "I am about to become the husband of the man who owns half the city. I think being nervous is reasonable." For the first time, Alexander almost laughed. It was a small reaction, but Ethan noticed it. The famous emperor of industry, the man known for his serious expression and impossible standards, had a softer side that almost nobody saw. The wedding announcement was scheduled for the following week. Before that happened, Ethan needed to understand the rules of this new world. Alexander introduced him to his team, explained the business environment, and made one thing clear. You do not have to become someone else. Ethan looked surprised. "Most people around you probably expect me to change." "Most people are wrong," Alexander replied. Those words stayed with Ethan. Back at the Parker mansion, Richard Parker watched the news reports about Alexander Whitmore's upcoming marriage. His expression changed when he saw Ethan's name appear beside Alexander's. The son he had dismissed was suddenly connected to the most influential man in the country. Richard immediately called his advisors. He needed answers. How did Ethan meet Alexander? Why would Alexander choose him? And most importantly, what did this mean for the Parker family? Meanwhile, Ethan stood inside Alexander's private residence, looking at the city lights outside the window. Everything was beautiful, but he still felt like a visitor. "Do you regret agreeing?" Alexander asked. Ethan turned around. "I do not know yet." Alexander nodded. "That is honest." Ethan looked at him. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Alexander asked. "Someone who only cares about power." Alexander looked away for a moment. "Maybe I was that person once." The silence between them felt different now. It was no longer the silence between strangers. It was the quiet understanding between two people who both knew what it felt like to stand alone. Over the next few days, Ethan slowly became part of Alexander's world. He learned about the company, met the people who trusted Alexander, and discovered that behind the billionaire image was someone who carried his own loneliness. But just as Ethan began feeling comfortable, a message arrived from an unknown number. It was from his father. "We need to talk. You have no idea what you have started." Ethan stared at the screen, feeling the past trying to pull him back. But this time, he was not standing alone. And somewhere in the city, Richard Parker was about to learn that the son he rejected was no longer the person he thought he knew. The message from Richard Parker stayed on Ethan's screen for several minutes. He read it again and again, wondering how the same person who had turned him away could suddenly need to talk. A few weeks ago, Ethan would have answered immediately. He would have hoped for an apology. He would have searched for any sign that his father still cared. But everything had changed. "Are you going to respond?" Alexander asked. Ethan looked up from his phone. They were sitting in the quiet library of Alexander's residence, surrounded by books and the soft glow of afternoon sunlight. "I do not know what to say," Ethan admitted. Alexander closed the book in his hand. "Then do not say anything until you know." Ethan looked at him carefully. "You always make things sound simple. Most things become complicated when people are afraid of the answer." That sentence stayed with Ethan. Alexander had a way of seeing through him without making him feel weak. He never pushed. He never demanded. He simply waited. The days before the public announcement passed. Quickly, Ethan attended meetings, learned about Alexander's world, and slowly discovered that being beside him was not about luxury. It was about trust. Alexander noticed small things nobody else did. He noticed when Ethan skipped lunch because he was too focused. He noticed when Ethan became quiet after reading another article about his family. He noticed when Ethan doubted himself. "You do not have to prove that you belong here," Alexander told him one evening. Ethan looked away. "I spent my entire life trying to prove that." Alexander's expression changed slightly. "Then maybe it is time someone told you that you never had to." Those words created a silence that felt different from before. A silence filled with understanding. Meanwhile, the Parker family was struggling to control the situation. News of Ethan's upcoming marriage had spread everywhere. Investors, reporters, and business partners were suddenly asking questions. Richard Parker could not understand how the son he had dismissed had become connected to Alexander Whitmore. "He must have convinced Alexander somehow," Richard said. But even he could not believe his own words. Deep down, he knew Alexander Whitmore was not someone who could be manipulated. Alexander built his empire by making careful decisions. If he chose Ethan, there had to be a reason. The official announcement day arrived. Cameras gathered outside Whitmore Tower. Reporters waited for their first glimpse of the couple. Ethan stood beside Alexander, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes on him. His hands were slightly tense, but Alexander quietly said, "Look at me, not them." Ethan turned toward him. "Why?" Alexander answered without hesitation. "Because I want you to remember who chose you." Those words gave Ethan the confidence he needed. When they stepped in front of the cameras, the world saw something unexpected. They saw Alexander Whitmore, the most powerful businessman in the country, standing beside Ethan Parker, the son his own family had rejected. Questions filled the air. Some people wondered who Ethan was. Others questioned why Alexander would make such a personal decision. But Ethan remained calm. For the first time in his life, he was not trying to earn approval. He was simply standing where he belonged. Later that evening, after the announcement ended, Ethan received another message from Richard Parker. This time, it was not angry. It was desperate. "Please come home. We need to discuss your future." Ethan stared at the words and slowly turned off his phone. A month ago, those words would have meant everything. Now, they only reminded him of how far he had come. And as Alexander stood beside him, Ethan realized something important. He had not lost his family that night. He had finally found himself. The world had started seeing Ethan Parker differently, but Richard Parker still saw him as the same person he had pushed away. That was the mistake he was about to regret. After the public announcement, Ethan expected his life to become easier. Instead, he discovered that being beside Alexander Whitmore came with a different kind of pressure. Every decision was watched. Every appearance became a topic of conversation. People wanted to know who Ethan was and why Alexander had chosen him. But the person who surprised Ethan the most was Alexander himself. Behind the image of the powerful businessman was someone who quietly cared about the smallest details. One morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen and found breakfast already prepared. He looked at Alexander with confusion. "Did you make this?" Alexander glanced up from his tablet. "No, my chef did." Ethan smiled slightly. "You could have just said that." Alexander looked almost amused. "You look like you were expecting something else." Ethan laughed softly. It was a simple moment, but it felt different. Before meeting Alexander, Ethan had forgotten what it felt like to have someone notice him. Meanwhile, the Parker family was facing growing problems. Richard had spent years building an image of control and success, but now every decision was being questioned. People were no longer only talking about the Parker family. They were talking about Ethan Parker and the man who stood beside him. Richard believed he could fix everything with one conversation. He invited Ethan to the family estate. When Ethan arrived, the place looked exactly the same. The large entrance, the expensive decorations, the memories of a life where he had always felt like a guest. Richard stood waiting in the living room. "You have changed," Richard said. Ethan remained calm. "No, I think I am finally the person I always was." That answer surprised Richard. For years, he expected Ethan to return asking for approval. Instead, Ethan stood there with confidence. "Your marriage with Alexander has created a tension," Richard said carefully. "Our family could benefit from working together again." Ethan understood immediately. His father was not calling because he missed him. He was calling because he saw an opportunity. The realization hurt, but it no longer controlled him. "You still see everything as a transaction," Ethan said quietly. Richard looked uncomfortable. "I am trying to protect this family." "No, Ethan replied. You were trying to protect your reputation. The room became silent. It was the first time Ethan had spoken to his father without fear. When Ethan returned to Whitmore Tower, Alexander noticed something was different. How did it go? Alexander asked. Ethan looked out at the city through the glass windows. I thought I wanted an apology. He paused. But I realized I wanted something else. Alexander waited. I wanted to stop needing one. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander stepped closer and said, That is the strongest thing you have said since I met you. Ethan looked at him. You really believe that? Alexander answered immediately. I do. But neither of them knew that Richard Parker was not finished. That same night, he made a decision that would change everything. He planned to reveal a secret about Ethan's past, a secret he believed would destroy Ethan's new life. What Richard did not understand was that the truth he was hiding would not bring Ethan down. It would finally show the world who Ethan Parker really was. The secret Richard Parker believed would destroy Ethan was finally ready to be revealed. For days, Richard searched for the perfect moment to take control of the situation. He believed he still understood Ethan. He believed the quiet son who once stood in the corner of every family gathering was still the same person who needed his approval. But Richard had not noticed the most important change. Ethan was no longer waiting for permission to be valued. The announcement came during a major business event hosted by the Parker family. Reporters, investors, and important guests filled the room as Richard stepped onto the stage with confidence. He smiled for the cameras and spoke about family, success, and loyalty. Then he introduced the topic everyone had been waiting for. There have been many questions about my son Ethan Parker, Richard said. Ethan, who was watching the event with Alexander, immediately understood something was wrong. Alexander noticed the change in his expression. What is it? Alexander asked. Ethan looked at the screen. My father is preparing something. Richard continued speaking. He told the audience that Ethan had never been involved in the family business the way people believed. He suggested that Ethan had simply benefited from the Parker name and had used his connection with Alexander to gain attention. The room became filled with whispers. For a moment, Ethan felt the familiar feeling from his childhood return, the feeling of being judged before anyone knew the truth. But this time was different. He was not standing alone. Alexander looked at Ethan calmly and said, Do you trust me? Ethan nodded. Yes. Then let me show them the truth. Moments later, Alexander entered the event with Ethan beside him. The room became silent. Nobody expected the Emperor of Industry to appear. Richard's confidence faded when he saw Alexander walking toward the stage. Alexander, this is a family matter, Richard said. Alexander looked at him calmly. No, this became a public matter when you decided to tell a story that was not true. The entire room watched as Alexander revealed documents proving something nobody expected. Ethan had been secretly helping Parker Industries for years. He had created strategies, solved major problems, and provided ideas that protected the company during difficult times. But Richard had never given him credit. He had hidden Ethan's contributions because he believed the family image was more important than the truth. The room fell silent. People who once ignored Ethan were now looking at him with respect. Richard stared at the documents, unable to explain. Why did you never tell anyone? He asked. Ethan looked at his father. There was no anger in his voice, only sadness. Because I was never trying to impress everyone. I was trying to help my family. Alexander stepped beside Ethan. That is the difference between you and him, Richard. Ethan built things without needing recognition. You destroyed things while chasing it. The truth spread quickly. The people who had doubted Ethan began to understand the person he had always been. Later that evening, Ethan stood outside Whitmore Tower, watching the city lights. I thought proving myself would make me happy, he said quietly. Alexander stood beside him. And did it? Ethan smiled. No, because I finally realized I was never the person who needed to change. Alexander looked at him with pride. But far away, Richard Parker sat alone with the consequences of his choices. For the first time, he understood that losing Ethan was not because Ethan walked away. It was because he never truly saw the son standing in front of him. The days after the truth was revealed felt different for Ethan Parker. For the first time, people were not looking at him because of his family name or because he was standing beside Alexander Whitmore. They were looking at him because they finally understood who he had always been. But even after the world learned the truth, Ethan still carried emotions he had spent years hiding. Success could change his circumstances, but it could not erase every memory of feeling unwanted. One evening, Ethan stood inside the quiet garden behind Whitmore Tower, watching the city lights shine across the skyline. Alexander found him there. "You have been quiet today," Alexander said. Ethan smiled slightly. "I am thinking about everything that happened." Alexander stood beside him. "About your father?" Ethan looked down. "About the person I wanted him to be." The answer was honest. Ethan was not thinking about revenge. He was thinking about all the moments when he wished his father would simply see him. "I spent so many years trying to prove I deserved a place in my own family," Ethan said. "And now that everyone knows the truth, I still feel like something is missing." Alexander listened carefully. He never rushed Ethan's feelings away. "That is because recognition does not repair every wound," Alexander said. Ethan looked at him, surprised. "You understand that?" Alexander looked toward the city. "More than you know." For the first time, Ethan saw the loneliness behind Alexander's confidence. The world saw a man who had everything, but Ethan saw someone who had also spent years carrying responsibilities alone. "You built an empire," Ethan said, "but you still sound like someone who feels alone." Alexander gave a small smile. "Maybe that is why I noticed you." The quiet moment between them felt important. Neither of them needed to explain everything. They both understood what it meant to be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. Meanwhile, Richard Parker was facing the consequences of his choices. The people who once followed him without question were now asking why he had ignored Ethan's contributions for so long. The family reputation he protected for years was changing because the truth had finally appeared. Richard returned to the same room where he had once told Ethan to leave. But this time, the silence felt different. The mansion that once represented power now reminded him of what he had lost. He looked at old family photographs and realized something painful. Ethan had never wanted his money. He had never wanted his position. He had only wanted to be accepted. The next day, Richard requested a meeting with Ethan. When they sat across from each other, neither spoke immediately. Finally, Richard lowered his eyes. "I was wrong." Ethan remained quiet. Those were words he had waited years to hear, but now they felt different. "I thought success was about creating the perfect family image," Richard continued. "I forgot that a family is made of people, not appearances." Ethan listened carefully. Part of him wanted to believe everything could return to the way it was before, but he knew some things could not be undone. "I appreciate that you finally understand," Ethan said softly. "But I cannot become the person I was before." Richard nodded. He knew his son was right. Later that evening, Ethan returned to Alexander. He expected questions, but Alexander simply asked, "Are you okay?" Ethan smiled. "I think I am finally becoming okay." Alexander looked at him and said, "Good, because you deserve a life where you do not have to fight to be chosen." Ethan looked at the person who had entered his life when everyone else walked away. And for the first time, he realized something. Family was not always the people who shared your name. Sometimes, it was the person who saw your worth before the world did. Months had passed since Ethan Parker walked away from the family that once made him feel invisible. The world had changed, but Ethan knew the most important change happened inside himself. He no longer measured his worth by the opinions of people who refused to see him. He had built a new life beside Alexander Whitmore, a life that was not based on a family name or a business empire, but on trust and understanding. One quiet morning, Ethan stood inside the Whitmore headquarters, looking at the city below. The same view that once made him feel small now reminded him of how far he had come. Alexander entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You are thinking too much again," Alexander said. Ethan smiled. "Is that your professional opinion?" "Yes," Alexander replied. "I have studied many things. Your habit of overthinking is one of the easiest to recognize." Ethan laughed softly. It was a simple moment, but it represented everything that had changed. Before Alexander entered his life, Ethan believed he had to earn every bit of kindness he received. Now he understood that real connection was not something someone had to beg for. It was something freely given. Alexander placed a coffee cup on the desk and looked at him. "Do you remember the first night we met?" Ethan nodded. "I remember thinking you were impossible to understand." "And now?" Alexander asked. Ethan smiled. "Now I think you are still impossible to understand. But I know you care." Alexander looked away for a moment, hiding a rare smile. Their relationship had started as an agreement between 2 people who needed a new direction. But somewhere along the way, it became something neither of them expected. They became partners. They became a team. They became the place where the other person felt safe. Meanwhile, Richard Parker slowly began rebuilding his relationship with Ethan. He knew forgiveness could not happen overnight. He knew apologies could not erase years of distance. But for the first time, Richard stopped trying to control the outcome. He simply tried to be honest. During a family dinner several weeks later, Richard looked at Ethan and said, "I spent so much time protecting our family image that I forgot to protect my family." Ethan listened quietly. Those words would have meant everything years ago. Now, they meant something different. They were not a way to fix the past. They were a beginning. "I cannot change what happened," Ethan said. "But I appreciate that you are trying now." Richard nodded. It was not a perfect reunion. It was not a magical solution. It was something more realistic. Two people learning how to move forward. Later that evening, Ethan and Alexander walked through the city together. The streets were bright, and the sounds of the city surrounded them. Ethan looked around and realized he no longer felt like someone who had been abandoned. He felt like someone who had found his place. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you never stopped that night?" Ethan asked. Alexander looked at him. "Sometimes." "And what do you think?" Alexander answered. "I think some people enter our lives at the exact moment we need them." Ethan smiled. He once believed losing his family meant losing everything. But now he understood the truth. Sometimes, the ending of one chapter creates the space for a better one to begin. The person who was once rejected had discovered his own value. The man who seemed to have everything had discovered something he never expected. And together, Ethan Parker and Alexander Whitmore built a future where neither of them had to wonder if they were chosen. They already knew they were.